I'm excited to do the intro this time. Hello, welcome to the third episode of that Encyclopedia podcast, and I think I'm going to let you introduce it this time, our topic of the day. We are discussing the Parthenon in Greece, in Athens. Could you tell us what the Parthenon is?
The Parthenon is a former temple in Greece by Athens, built on the Athenian Acropolis. Now, the Athenian Acropolis is an ancient citadel on a rocky outcrop by the city of Athens. The Parthenon was built as a temple dedicated to the goddess Athena, also known as Pallas Athena, which is an epithet attributed to her for her killing of a titan with a similar name during the war against the Titans. It was built quite a long time ago, this Parthenon. Construction began in 447 BC, and it took until 438 BC to be completed, but decoration of the building continued for another 6 years. It has some architectural significance and is considered the peak of what is known as the Doric order, which is sort of it's an architectural order of ancient Greece. The way these different phases of architecture are generally characterized is that is by the types of Greek columns that are associated with them. That's what might actually be recognizable. If you go to any of the sites. So I can even run through some of them for you, just because I think the Doric or Dorian order is this Parthenon is quite significant to. So the Doric order is sort of the oldest of the ancient Greek orders, which is associated in the great Greek columns. Obviously the Romans liked columns too. They had some of their own orders. And I guess I will bring up a picture here to show the different types of column, where the Doric column is fairly simple compared to the others, where the top of the column is basically a wider disc, which then connects to whatever roof it is suspending. The Ionic columns are the most iconic Greek-looking columns, in my opinion. Ionic columns have this sort of furled scroll look to them at the top of a column that normally has many grooves vertically all around it. And the third order, the latter order, is the Corinthian order, and the Corinthian pillars, columns, typically have these very elaborate masonry at the top of them, looking like a pattern of feathers maybe on a crown. Have you had a look at the orders? What do you think of them? Is the Parthenon the zenith of the Doric order?
I think, from what little I know about architecture, undoubtedly. You touched on so much there. You're clearly way better at these introductions than I am. I think you should lead them from now on. The architecture of the Parthenon. I guess we'll start there. The orders that you've described, what I found interesting reading around them, although there's obviously a lot more to it than this, seemed to focus entirely on the use of columns, as you've kind of been discussing.
Yes.
And there's this strange sense of, on the one hand, you have, if you're studying architecture, so many considerations from building size, design, layout, both external and internal, decoration, colouring, structural integrity, the mathematics behind everything. And on the other hand, you also just have 3 orders of architectural styles entirely dedicated to how you should be using columns in your buildings. And it inspires great sadness in me that we're not using columns to a greater extent in modern architectural design, purely because we have at least 3 orders of architecture devoted to their proper use and function.
That's a good point. How many columns on the building where you live?
There are no columns in my house, architecturally speaking.
Sad.
Like, it's
very sad.
Yeah.
No columns on my house either.
It's quite poor. I think that the Parthenon as well, the considerations that the architects had to acknowledge. The architects for the Parthenon are credited as two people called Iktinos and Callicrates. The building was so big, it's to the nearest meter, it's 30 meters wide, 70 meters long, and 20 meters tall, I think, at its highest point. Actually, I should really be going on the article. The article claims that it's 14 meters tall to the nearest meter, but I did some additional research in preparation for the podcast, and that claimed it was even taller. So we immediately have a discrepancy here. But let's go with the article. It says 14 meters tall. There we go. And the sheer scale of the Parthenon was so big that the human eye distorts straight lines at this distance. So even if you built a structure to those dimensions and kept everything perfectly vertical and perfectly straight, and the kind of the box rectilinear design kind of at 90-degree angles everywhere, it would create an optical illusion to make it look slightly bowed towards the middle. And the architects knew this, and so compensated for it by making the corner and outside columns lean inwards slightly towards the center, and the columns themselves expand outwards ever so slightly, only by, I think, a few centimeters, less than 2 inches, before returning to their original width if you were to go from top to bottom or bottom to top. And this kind of expansion of the columns and tilt of their positioning negates the illusory effect when you're looking at such large structures at a distance. And so the Parthenon looks perfectly rectilinear, even though it isn't quite. And I find that amazing, that I think I never give enough credit to the intelligence and accomplishments of people who lived basically before the invention of the computer, as far as I'm concerned. And I really should, because I'm consistently amazed at things that were known, acknowledged, and able to be accounted for using the constraints of a technology at the time. The columns were made by kind of making little slices of marble at the correct width, but 1/16 of the height, and then gradually stacking them up to create this lean effect, and then filling in the gaps. It was just amazing. So as an architectural symbol, the Parthenon is worthy of intense study, and indeed has been for hundreds of years. There's entire paragraphs of information about various architects from Greece, Germany, later kind of America, Ottoman architects studying it. The building was converted several times in its history, almost pushing kind of 2,500 years now. So it's really something, and I've had the pleasure and privilege of visiting it about 4 years ago now, and even though it's a ruined building, it's preserved but still in ruins for the most part, nowhere near as impressive as it would have been when it was first completed. But nevertheless, even in this diminished state, it remains incredibly impressive to behold. And the headline image that Wikipedia uses, even though it's basically just a roofless marble structure with nothing surrounding it and no coloration left, is still breathtaking. So those are my initial thoughts on the architecture of the Parthenon.
This article is chock full of jargon that I did not understand upon first reading, whether that's words pertaining to Greek history or simply just words pertaining to regular features of architecture that are just plopped in here that I have to hover over and read every single definition to know what it's talking about.
It is. Yeah. I made a note of, was going to raise the same thing actually. This article was particularly challenging because it's this unity between a lot of Greek words and names, proper nouns, that I would hesitate to try and pronounce spontaneously without making a fool of myself, and also a lot of English words, but English words from the jargon of architecture, which is often code for kind of more Greek and Latin words anyway, or French words sometimes. And when you combine these two together in an article, it makes for challenging reading to speak aloud with confidence in particular. But the word Acropolis itself, when you're introducing the Parthenon as the kind of the keystone building in the Acropolis of Athens, the Acropolis was quite a straightforward one, where polis being the kind of the Greek for city, and akros being height or high place. So the Acropolis is the high city of Athens, this kind of city within a city. And although it wasn't built as a fortress initially, it is kind of a natural fortress just because of its design, and has been fortified and defortified and then refortified throughout the years, as various civilizations and armies and even pirates at one point occupied the city. And the Parthenon, just to kind of situate it, is located within the Acropolis, but the Acropolis as a citadel of Athens contains various other famous buildings as well. There's the much smaller temple of Athena Nike, which I understand to be the kind of the more religious temple. The Parthenon itself, despite being a temple in construction and design, was probably not ever used for religious ceremonies as you might envision them. There's no altar within the temple. The Parthenon was used as a treasury, and as a kind of votive dedication to the goddess Athena, but also perhaps to Athens as a city, as a symbol of Doric hegemony at the time of its construction. But the Acropolis, as well as having the temple of Athena Nike and the Parthenon, also has the Propylaea, which is, I think, the gatehouse that you would have to go through to enter the citadel, and also the Erechtheion, which is another temple of Athena, temple of Athena Polias, that I think is the largest proper religious building in the Acropolis. So the whole, you see this cultural site, this monument, the Parthenon, and then you zoom out and you realize, oh my god, it's just one of about five major famous sites located within this Acropolis, and many others besides that have been lost to the ravages of time. So it's really something I encourage visiting if people get the chance. It's very impressive.
It indeed looks quite magnificent from the pictures. I was thinking, especially with your explanation of the Acropolis, that I really do think that the location in which you choose to build something like this can certainly contribute to its majesty. So having built such a grand temple on the highest point in the midst of a grand city, you can basically see it from all around, and from the building itself you can see all around. It reminds me of I don't know if you've ever been to Whitby, but Whitby Abbey has a similar effect, just having the abbey high on a hill adjacent to the town. It adds some striking grandeur, and it's nice to be able to see a beautiful building from all around.
But do you think that could serve as a bit of a double-edged sword in some cases, though, because the Parthenon has been, alongside the Acropolis and Athens more generally, but the Parthenon specifically has been kind of looted and destroyed several times in its 2,500 year history, hasn't it?
Yes. I don't know what to say about what could contribute to it. I mean, you could say it's a double-edged sword. It might just be the nature of having a building so grand in a contested city. Obviously, you could build a regular building and call it the Parthenon, but I don't think it would be quite the same. So yes, I think to some extent it may have made it a target. But then you could say, I mean, it's hard to know what would have happened to the building if there were slight differences to how it was built, where it was built. It was built in a citadel, so I don't know if that makes it more prone to being attacked or just better defended.
Well, I want to briefly go on a tangent about someone who stood out to me whilst reading this article by the name of Francesco Morrissini of Venice. Do you recognise this name? Because I'm
afraid I do not recognise the name, having read the article today.
Because the more I read about this man and his relationship to the Parthenon, the more I am basically convinced that he was just a bit rude, really. So I was about to swear. I don't really want to swear. So the Francesco Morrissini was born in 1619, died in 1694. He was, at the end stages of his life, the Doge of Venice, which during this time was an independent and very wealthy city-state in what would later unite as the Kingdom of Italy. And he served, before he was the Doge of Venice, as a general during the Morean War against the Ottoman Empire. And he was leading his troops and had besieged Athens, which at the time was under the control of the Ottomans. And the Ottomans had fortified the Acropolis as a natural high point of the city, and had decided, for reasons that I can't quite figure out, to store a ton of gunpowder and other explosives in the Parthenon building. It was an ammo dump, an ammo magazine. And apparently the defending Ottomans also used it as a refuge for the Turkish people in Athens as well, who were kind of trying to avoid death and despair in the siege. And what undisputably happened is a Venetian mortar explosive shell hit the Parthenon in just the right way to ignite the gunpowder and blew it all up. And it almost destroyed the entire building. A ton of the many of the columns collapsed. The roof caved in several places. What remained of the sculptures at this time were damaged even further. Over 100 people, mostly civilians, who were taking refuge in the Parthenon, were killed. And it was basically a tragedy to history and cultural significance. The debate is ongoing about whether this was a deliberate shot taken at the Parthenon by Morrisini at his directive, or whether it was kind of an accident and it was just lucky and they were kind of shelling the general area. However, it's said that an attaché, I'm quoting from Morrisini's article now, an attaché to the Swedish field commander General Otto Wilhelm Königsmark wrote later, quote, "How it dismayed His Excellency," that is Morrisini, "to destroy the beautiful temple which had existed 3,000 years. By contrast, Morrisini, who was the commander-in-chief of the operation, described it in his report to the Venetian government as a fortunate shot." And after he eventually was successful in besieging Athens, and after he had occupied the city, he directed his troops to go out of their way to loot the Parthenon that had been damaged by removing some of the surviving sculptures from the pediments and the metopes and the friezes. But his troops were not expert masons and massively screwed it up. And all that happened was a sculpture of Poseidon, among other things, fell from the top of the building and smashed into the ground and further damaged it. Nobody got anything. And so the Wikipedia article in one location calls this the Morrisini Explosion as kind of a subtle insult to this guy who blew up the Parthenon, or indirectly, and then proceeded to loot it and did not regret this in the slightest. I felt my blood pressure rising reading about this. I just wanted to share that little side story that I went on when researching the Parthenon.
There's always someone trying to shoot or blow up a nice, wonderful piece of ancient architecture. Whether it's the pyramids, whether it's the Parthenon. Yeah, doesn't sound like Morrisini has done much for the cause of preserving the Parthenon. But, on the other hand, you could say he's certainly contributed to its history.
Well, I guess that's technically true, in the kind of worst kind of way.
Yeah.
I mean, would you like to get into a tiny, just a pinch of politics here? Because the Parthenon is kind of not entirely in Greece, is it? I mean, it's mostly in Greece, but
the
almost
there.
The shell of the building's there. Almost none of the sculptures are presently on the skeleton of the building, though. So the kind of decorative elements of the building itself. There was also, by the way, an enormous, I think, 11-meter statue of Athena. This is another slight tangent, but you'll get used to it. Of Athena inside, that is described as a chryselephantine, which is just fancy language for gold and ivory statue of Athena that cost thousands of talents, which is, I mean, the whole treasury of the city was, I think, something like 10 to 15,000 talents. So it kind of cost a solid double-figure percentage of the entire wealth of Athens at the time to construct, and was the reason the main eastern room of the Parthenon temple even existed, the naos. You would walk in and it would be an empty room except for this 11-meter gold and ivory statue of Athena inside, dominating the space. But the statue was lost. There was a fire in quite, well, I say early into its history, about 500 to 1,000 years into its history, and it was converted during the Roman Byzantine Empire period into a Christian church dedicated to the Virgin Mary. And by the time the conversion was complete, the sources no longer mention this statue. So the statue must have been moved, possibly to Constantinople, or possibly destroyed in a fire, or looted. We're not sure what's happened to it, and I find this deeply distressing that this 11-meter gold and ivory statue is just lost to history and no one knows what happened to it.
It's quite a big savings bond to lose your lodging for.
Yeah, but apart from that, the actual decor of the buildings itself are divided into kind of three stages. There are the pediments on the east and west flanks of the Parthenon, which are the kind of the triangle that mounts the top of the roof, and then you have the metopes, which are the scenes that run the outer rim directly beneath the pediments and also then go onto the long north and south sides. And then on the internal building, the Keller, you have the frieze sculptures, and they all depict different things, but almost none of them are there anymore. Some of them have just been lost to time and history. Some of them have been destroyed and documented.
It's Morrisini.
Some of them are in the Acropolis Museum in Athens. One of them is in the Louvre in Paris, France, for some reason. But a lot of them are currently in the British Museum. And since the 70s or the 80s, the Greek government has been very vocal about wanting them back. And the British Museum has maintained a consistent policy of no. And the British government has not intervened. It's they're kind of staying out of it. It would require legislation from the British government to compel a British museum to return, well, anything, including the sculptures of the Parthenon, and that hasn't happened, and the British Museum is not going to do it of its own volition. So part of the Parthenon is currently in the British Museum, amongst other places. I would welcome your views on this.
You said that there was no demonstration of willingness from British governments. I believe there were some discussions, at least, between Greek and British cultural ministries in 2007, but I'm not aware of any negotiations since then.
Oh, there was that one sentence, wasn't there, at the end of this section of the article that just said discussions took place 15 years ago.
Yes.
We have no idea, like, that's it.
Yeah. Although I don't know, it's hard to really know what the government at that time was thinking, because I mean that was around the end of that Labour government, and we've subsequently had Conservative governments, and I don't know if they have a different stance on the Elgin or Parthenon marbles to the former Labour government. I haven't heard Keir Starmer talking about returning the marbles.
No, but do you feel that they, if you were prime minister with a commanding majority and the power to compel the British Museum to return these sculptures. Would you take those steps, kind of on principle, other considerations notwithstanding? Or
I'd certainly had a think about it. Firstly, I would like to ask the British Museum why. What exactly is their case for not returning them? See, I understand that they are probably a significant contribution to the British Museum. However, if the entire nation of Greece feels so strongly compelled to regularly demand them back, I can see how, in the circumstances by which Britain acquired the marbles, they wouldn't be too happy with us keeping them. So I mean, I don't really know what the argument is for not returning them. I'm sure there is some. My interest would be mainly on if they are to be returned. Let's make sure we return them safely. We don't want to damage any more of them.
Yeah.
Yeah. What do you think?
I'm inclined to agree. Really, I think I think phrasing it. I think it's very easy, especially because it's called the British Museum. It's very easy to kind of lean into this, UK versus Greece, or indeed, UK versus, let's say, Egypt for the Rosetta Stone, or whatever cultural property you're discussing. Almost kind of patriotic nationalist tone. But I think, to take a more holistic view, everyone who runs a serious museum is more or less in agreement that they're kind of dedicated to, well, whatever, humanity, history, art, culture, science, whatever your museum is documenting. And I think there's an argument to be made for museums keeping property if, and probably only if, there's a legitimate case that were the artifacts to be returned to their point of origin or nearest equivalent, that they may be in danger there. So, for example, if there's a civil war going on in the location where the objects originated, that if it's a statue, for example, might be damaged in a conflict. But barring that kind of extreme scenario, I don't really see why cultural property shouldn't be repatriated. I think everyone's, it's not going to be destroyed or damaged in Greece any more than it is in the UK. I think the risk is the same, and it doesn't really matter. There's no. I don't really see a strong reason for the British Museum to retain it beyond its kind of its own institutional prestige. I don't really think that's a good enough reason. Also, if we get as much of the original Parthenon back to Greece as possible, then there's a slim possibility that we might be able to revamp the Parthenon. I would love to see that, put it all back, all of it, as much as we can. That's anything that could possibly survive. Enormous investment, maybe get an EU grant, and just paint it again, make it beautiful as it was when it was first completed. I mean, that would be amazing. And it wouldn't take, well, actually it might, but it probably wouldn't take the 15 years that it took the ancient Greeks to build it from scratch, because, most of it's still there. I think that would be an incredible achievement, and a much better use of time and money than just kind of having it scattered across the planet. Put it all back in one place. Be amazing.
Well, I doubt that the restoration would be complete within 15 years, given it was begun in around 1975. There is still restoration work going on, and yeah, I agree. I think if we could stick some more of it together, that would just be really magnificent, wouldn't it? To be able to restore a building to um, to a point of being fairly close to how it was when it was built, like 2,500 years ago. That's just a magnificent idea. And I do think that from reading about the technicality of this, it is essentially the British Museum acting in the British Museum's interests, which is why they haven't returned them. It's not that necessarily that no government might have some view on the matter, but as you said, it would require legislation to actually force them to give it back. And the moment you start doing legislation, you have to really take stock of what the British public thinks. And I'm not actually sure what the British public thinks. That's one thing I could have looked into, any polling on the Elgin marbles.
Yeah. I think we more or less agree. I mean, I think it's quite. I think it just looks quite poor that in the history, in the later history section of the article, right, you have and most of the sections basically describe the Parthenon being damaged or converted in some way, because when everything's fine and dandy, nothing's really happening with the Parthenon. You know, it's just standing there looking grand and dominating the skyline with the rest of the Acropolis of Athens, and that's its job, right? It's doing splendidly. So when something happens, it's normally something negative that changes this status quo. So in the later history section, we have late antiquity. A fire breaks out in the middle of the 3rd century, which destroyed the roof and some of the Keller. And then these Germanic peoples called the Heruli, which the article calls pirates, which is way cooler, but there you go, sacked Athens in 276 and destroyed the Parthenon kind of again. And then it was converted several hundred years later to the Church of the Theotokos, the Virgin Mary, under Byzantine rule, and then the Ottomans captured it, and it was converted again into a mosque, although it was possibly briefly restored to a Greek Orthodox Christian church rather than a Catholic Christian church first, but then it ultimately became a mosque for a little bit, and then it was blown up by Francesco Morrissini and his army, and then Greece got its independence and took steps to restore it, and then dispute over the marbles. Thomas Bruce, 7th Earl of Elgin, who claims to have received permission from the local kind of ruler at the time, but there's no evidence that he did, or the evidence is disputed, and actually the article itself has citation needed next to the sentence, which I found funny in a meta sense. But yeah, basically, if you're appearing in the Parthenon's history and it's in the later history section rather than the restoration section, you should probably reconsider your position.
I think, yes, I really think it would be quite a contrast, because I think having not done something to ensure the restoration of the marbles, although it's the British Museum, as we said, although it's got British in the name, it's not the representation of all the British people. The British Museum currently doesn't want to hand them back, but because we haven't made our government do so, it kind of reflects poorly upon us as a nation, or at least also looks poorly, probably doesn't do great things for Greek and British cultural relations, whereas we would have quite the opposite story if suddenly we were to return the marbles, I think, because they were taken by an individual and they would have been returned by a nation. So I hardly think that we would remain at fault if we were to give them back.
Have you ever played Assassin's Creed Odyssey?
I considered getting it, but I've not played it, no.
Okay, neither have I. But I've been informed that AC Odyssey has a very what's the correct adjective? I don't want to say realistic, but kind of faithful attempt at recreating what the Acropolis may have looked like in its prime when that game takes place, right at the kind of the height of Hellenistic Greece, and that there's a function in the game to kind of link key locations that you can visit with historical documents and locations, and you can kind of learn about the real world as depicted in and through this game, which I think is a really cool idea. And if Ubisoft Entertainment can do it, I think we can do it too. You know, we can mobilize. This is the collective we, the Greek and British governments to try and regenerate the Acropolis as much as possible, because restoring it's one thing, and maybe it's just too expensive. Maybe it's not possible. And as you've said, you know, even the restoration projects just to preserve what's left are very, very expensive and take years and years. But
hard to get marble masons these days.
Yeah, but I just want to see in person the Acropolis in full colour, with full kind of restoration, no kind of tapes and barriers that you're not allowed to cross because you might accidentally collapse everything in front of it. I think it would just be amazing to be able to see that, and it's incredibly unrealistic. So I'm when I say I think we can do it, I mean more in the sense of it would be nice if it happened.
Yeah. Well, for the time being, you could always check out Assassin's Creed. I thought Origins and Odyssey both looked quite nice, but I haven't quite got through Black Flag yet, and I haven't gone back to it. So when I get stuck in a game franchise like that, seems to be a very narrow chance of me ever escaping beyond.
For sure. Well, was there anything else that you were burning to mention or discuss briefly about the Parthenon?
Nothing in particular. I think we've covered most of the discussion. I suppose actually the thing coming to my mind now is just linking back to the architectural prowess that we talked about back at the start. Just the scale of the construction, and just imagining what it would have been like back when it was being built is always something fun for me. This idea of all of these masons from all around the land who specialize in building temples coming together to build another one, and this one probably being the best one that they've contributed to. Must have been quite an exciting project to work on.
I mean, you often see this with cathedrals, kind of Western style cathedrals, don't you? It's often one of those fun facts when you go into a cathedral to have a look around. It says, did you know that it took this long to build? And some of the cathedrals took 10, 20, 50, 100 years to complete. And just the idea that even though the Parthenon only took 9 years, which if anything is a testament to the efficiency and power of the Athenian League at the time.
I'm surprised by that.
Yeah, I mean, another 6 years for the decoration, but still, 9 years for the construction. But the idea that a lot of these ancient projects, or medieval, even later, medieval projects, you could have families of masons, architects, carpenters, whatever, and it would be something that you worked on your entire life, or at least your entire career, that your dad worked on for his entire career, your granddad worked on for his entire career, the same building. I mean, talk about stable employment as well, if nothing else. Something that again might be lost to the times. I don't know if we really have an example of that. We're too good at building things now. We do it too quickly.